Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 24 of Series 7. The question for today is, what can utilitarianism offer to either ethics or to an understanding of human life? Reading, for those who want it, from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 4, Section 5. So in these workshops, I present the phenomenon of value as a solution to certain problems of human life. And ethics is one of the main expressions of value, along with aesthetics, religion, meaning, and others. And it thereby offers a wealth of research on the less examined questions of value. But grave problems confront all ethical theories, including Kantian and virtue ethics, as well as utilitarianism. And today I want to focus on the problems of utilitarianism as well as its key principle of happiness. This principle is that we should maximize the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. As practical social policy, this principle is difficult to dispute, but as a principle of ethics, it is woefully inadequate, and I want to explain why in this paper. Yet utilitarianism also has positive features, as implied above, that I want to discuss. Not least of these are the importance of consequences and the experience of happiness. This is because happiness is an accepted human good that can also tell us so much about human life. That is, happiness is an exemplary subject for a phenomenology of human experience, and as such it can tell us a lot about adequate and inadequate human objectives. John Stuart Mill formalized utilitarianism with the principle of utility as the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. That is, right and wrong are determined by consequences and measured in terms of happiness. This differs from Kantian and virtue ethics that determine morality by intention, action, and character. Utilitarianism is thereby regarded as practical, pragmatic, and rationalist. It is sometimes described with the saying, "the end justifies the means." So utilitarianism is a radical view that sweeps aside the problems of metaphysics and necessary relations. On this view, there is no need for God, categorical imperatives, or excellence of character. And again, the greatest happiness for the greatest number is very compelling as practical social policy. And because it's practical and pragmatic, it's the predominant ethical theory in Singapore. But utilitarianism is a radical view that also evokes strong responses, such as it seems to be hugely inadequate as an ethics because it omits so much, such as intention, character, and a wide range of human experiences that ethics should encompass. And my skepticism of ethics as an account of life is further exacerbated by utilitarian limitations. As we will say, utilitarianism seems to reveal a lack of insight into and awareness of mental life. And my particular concern is its lack of appreciation of value as a motivating factor. Derek Parfit, Barry Maguire, and others endorse such a value theory of reasons for action. These observations don't lead me to make ad hominem arguments against Mill, but explanations of the psychological reasons for holding philosophical views can be very revealing. Mill seems to be another flawed genius. He began studying Greek at 3 years old and Latin at 8, and he was already publishing articles defending his views by his early teens. But in his early 20s, Mill suffered a nervous breakdown. He believed that this was caused by his rigorous education that left him emotionally undeveloped. It is only my speculation that this motivated his barren and truncated view of utilitarian ethics. Further to this view, Nietzsche called Mill a blockhead, and Anscombe used the words stupid, and Charles Grey Shaw described the principle of utility as a crass ideal. It's also ironic that Mill has constructed a rationalist ethic that has produced emotive arguments against it. For example, Thomas Carlyle described utilitarianism as pig philosophy or a philosophy for swine, but Mill answered that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. This is supposed to show that humans have richer lives that enable them to be happier than pigs. And unlike Jeremy Bentham's pleasure, Mill accepts different kinds, qualities and degrees of happiness. But Mill still presents the richer lives of humans in terms of greater happiness, and he insists that all desires can only be directed towards pleasant experiences. Mill frames this idea with the words that to desire anything except in proportion as the idea of it is pleasant is a psychological and metaphysical impossibility, unquote. But this is a huge claim that is challenged by the possibility or the fact of other reasons for desiring things. And of course, Mill is presupposing that motivation is always initiated by desire rather than by cognition, and that his conception of the pleasant can be broad enough to encompass many variations. But even given Mill's presuppositions, other reasons than being pleasant can be cited for desiring things. These include cognitive theories, value theories, altruism, conflicting reasons, and sheer perversity. That is, perversity such as masochism and choosing adversity for psychological or ideological reasons. And Aristotle, Kant, and even Nietzsche agree on the possibility of reasons other than the pleasant. Yet in Mill's supposed proof of the principle of utility, he contends that the sole evidence that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it, unquote. He argues that we know pleasure is uniquely valuable because it's the only thing we desire for its own sake. I will argue against both these views about pleasure and happiness shortly. And Mill's account of motivation is also thought to be naive and outdated. One reason for this is that he argues from self-evidence, which is suspect. Another aspect of Mill's problem of motivation in utilitarianism is why must we act for the common good? Mill's informal response is that our own happiness results in making other people happy. Yet the contingency of this relation between our and others' happiness isn't adequate for ethical theory. So Mill answers formally with a theory not about how we ought to act, but a theory about how we must act. His claim of psychological and metaphysical necessity becomes a theory of psychological hedonism. But even if correct, this view does not resolve a further recurring problem. That is, why should necessarily pursuing personal happiness entail the pursuit of happiness for other people? Contingent answers about living in society with others don't satisfactorily answer this question. Yet these are theoretical problems that practical or applied ethics might want to dismiss. But there is also the practical problem of assessing, measuring and quantifying happiness. We could measure GNP, but happiness is an amorphous mental state and self-reporting is unreliable. These are severe problems for an ethics that is supposed to be practical and straightforward. Secondly, there's also a problem of knowing what the full consequences of any event are. This is expressed in the butterfly effect of its flapping wings causing a tornado in another continent. One response is that we nevertheless know the immediate or significant effects of an action. But the law of unintended consequences in economics challenges this view. And utilitarians are troubled enough by this to distinguish between act and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is the standard version of utilitarianism as the greatest good for the greatest number of people. But as individuals cannot work out the consequences of each of their actions, they adopt rules. Rule utilitarianism depends upon the correctness of rules to achieve the greatest good. This seems to push the problem further back, though, rather than resolve it. Rules are also inflexible and have their own unintended consequences. These are some of the formal problems of utilitarianism, but I'm more interested in its subjective failings. For these we can look at the work of Bernard Williams, one of the strongest critics of utilitarianism. One of his arguments is about the negative psychological consequences of utilitarianism. Williams gives an example of a group of soldiers about to kill a group of natives as a warning to others. In this story, a botanical expedition stumbles onto the scene. The soldiers say to the expedition leader, "If you kill one of the natives, we will let the others live. If you don't kill one of the natives, we will kill them all." The utilitarian answer is to kill one native and let all the others live. The problem is that the agent is committing an act that he finds deeply wrong. The result or consequence is that he experiences deep personal alienation. This is a problem for utilitarianism, which finds justification by assessing consequences. Utilitarianism typically assesses consequences in terms of forms of happiness as above. But utilitarianism can be replaced by consequentialism, which offers a wider range of consequences. Illustrations of what utilitarianism or consequentialism can leave out can be shown with trolley problems. The notion of trolley problems was introduced into the philosophical literature by Philippa Foot. Now consider these two cases. One, divert a train to save 5 people, but in doing so you kill one other person. 2, kill and cut up a healthy person to save 5 people with organ transplants. The utilitarian consequences are the same in both cases, but our moral judgment is very different in these two cases. This shows the inadequacy of utilitarianism in leaving things out. And trolley problems are set up in such a way as to focus on and assume certain philosophical presuppositions. These may be either utilitarian and or principles of equality and the value of people as ends in themselves. But one thinker, Alan Wood, finds trolley problems deceptive and misleading because they often deprive us of morally relevant facts that we would really have in real life. Such relevant facts could include the age of the people at risk and their status as heinous criminals or social saints. And with respect to virtue theory, the character and disposition of the agents, not of the people selected to live or die. Characteristics of excellence or weakness are legitimate factors that add to the real variables. Yet virtue theory considerations are largely ignored in these trolley problems. But I now want to first talk about the status of happiness as an intrinsic value. Mill argued that we know happiness is uniquely valuable because it's the only thing we desire for its own sake. Kant disagrees. He holds that the goodwill is the only thing that's good in itself. I also disagree on the grounds that value and value states can also be desired for their own sake. Moreover, and more simply, happiness can't be an intrinsically valuable state because it's not always valuable. An intrinsically valuable state has to be valuable all the time under all circumstances. So therefore, happiness isn't an intrinsically valuable state. And again, Kant doesn't regard happiness as valuable without qualification. I've recently examined the question of whether physical objects, abstract principles, actions, mental states, or people have intrinsic value. I agree with utilitarians that actions themselves don't have intrinsic value, but for different reasons. My view is that only mental states and people are candidates of intrinsic value, but that happiness is a mental state that does not have intrinsic value. This is because happiness is neither a value state nor always valuable. Value states are mental states in which values are essential to their existence. For example, liking something is a value state because something must be valued which is liked. Yet happiness is an intrinsically happy state, but it isn't a value state, nor an intrinsically valuable state. And even if it was an intrinsically valuable state, it would have to compete against other states of intrinsic value. This is because intrinsic value doesn't give priority or absolute value over other states. Yet I also want to say something more fundamental about happiness as a property of consciousness. That is, certain capacities like cognition and value are essential and are necessary properties of consciousness. That is, consciousness cannot exist without cognitive capacities. And myself and others would also like to add that consciousness cannot exist without value. But I think it's debatable whether sentience is a necessary property of consciousness. That is, whether feelings like pain, pleasure and happiness are necessary constituents of consciousness. That is, do conscious creatures like insects or artificially constructed consciousnesses and beings from another world necessarily have sentient capacities like pain and pleasure. This question is also discussed by David Chalmers in the context of zombies. Now, this poses the crucial question of whether happiness is a necessary constituent of consciousness. I myself can conceive of conscious beings hypothetically existing in the world without experiencing pain, pleasure or happiness. So this undermines Mill's view of happiness as a necessary objective. This is because happiness isn't even a necessary property of consciousness. And with respect to happiness as a necessary objective, Nietzsche rebuffs the idea with his sarcastic comment that man does not strive for happiness, only the Englishman does that. The above critique is unlikely to have much weight either for Mill or for practical or applied ethics. Yet that is indicative of a lack of both utilitarian imagination and phenomenological analysis. It also illustrates a neglect of both consciousness, value and other experiences. Human experience, however, covers a broad spectrum from brute pleasures to meaning, purpose and beyond. William James saw mind as offering a teeming multiplicity of objects and relations, and other theories of ethics offer other objectives apart from happiness. So we can ask the question, why should happiness be chosen as the primary human objective? Is it just a lack of imagination that limits the range of experience to either pleasure or happiness? Happiness is, of course, a great human good, featured in all theories of ethics and enshrined in the US Constitution. But as a principle of ethics, it is flawed, as indicated above, and has other problems, such as the happiness paradox, that looking for happiness ensures not finding it, and the hedonist treadmill, that the more you get, the more you want. Yet I don't find these two arguments conclusive, because there are ways of avoiding these problems, such as being wise and informed about the best way to pursue happiness. I find that the theoretical problems of happiness are more telling. My earlier arguments about the primacy of happiness in ethics was that it isn't of intrinsic value. This is significant because ethical justification needs to trace arguments back to principles of intrinsic value. An argument that happiness isn't of intrinsic value prevents utilitarianism from doing that. Moreover, happiness can be a valued affect state or psychological state, but not a value state. This is because happiness doesn't involve value and need not be valued at all. Happiness may be considered weakening, a false or misleading objective, or immoral. Kant agrees that happiness is not unconditionally valuable. Also, because happiness isn't a value state, it can't be an intrinsically valuable state. To extend our understanding of happiness as a principle of ethics or life, we can note further limitations. Firstly, because happiness lacks intrinsic value content, it can't validly offer meaning and purpose. Secondly, happiness is blind in that it is a non-cognitive affect state. That is, it doesn't itself have access to the crucial capacity of cognition to guide action. Cognitive reason and fact are used to direct action towards the possible goal of happiness. For example, imagine yourself in another world where the laws of physics are different. If you plunge your hand into a fire, you know that you must pull it out to stop the pain. But in another world, you might have to push your hand deeper into the fire to stop the pain. That is, your actions depend upon contingent knowledge of the world that you are living in. So cognition and reflective reason are crucial, and not just because they are essential means to attain ends. We cannot be either fully human or fully conscious without cognition and reason. Utilitarianism rightly holds that reason is also required to guide action. Yet this does not vindicate happiness as its ethical objective, nor does happiness alone provide an adequate theory without reason. But it's questionable that happiness or reason can provide an adequate theory. These are contrasts and comparisons that help us to assess happiness as a principle of ethics or of life. Utilitarianism is a theory of ethics, but it might also be expected to compete with theories of life. And comparisons between pleasure, happiness, value states, and cognition help us to assess these different theories. Pleasure and happiness have a certain self-sufficiency or independence from cognitive endorsement. That is, pleasure and happiness largely retain their satisfactions regardless of social endorsement. And I want to compare this sufficiency or independence with that of value states like self-esteem. In the case of pleasure, it remains pleasurable regardless of social disapproval, and it is fairly self-sufficient. That is, pleasure is barely influenced by cognitive factors like one's own beliefs or the beliefs of others. This is because pleasure typically has physiological origins and need not involve cognitive objects. Pleasure thereby has what I call the property of sufficiency. Happiness is more subject to circumstances, social endorsement, and cognitive considerations than pleasure. But happiness can still be satisfying in itself without external endorsement. Happiness thereby illustrates relative sufficiency in its relations with cognitive factors. Value states like love, honour, and esteem present a wide range of sufficiency and dependence on endorsement. Self-esteem may be strong, fairly sufficient, and relatively independent of social endorsement. In ethics, moral fortitude is the capacity to do the right thing in circumstances lacking support. Love is a value state that typically enjoys a relative independence from fact and circumstance. These brief comparisons indicate that pleasure and happiness have a more robust sufficiency than value states. But pleasure and happiness are affect states that are unable to deliver values such as meaning or purpose. We can now begin to make broader comparisons about these different states and even go beyond them. Pleasure, happiness, joy, self-esteem, and love appear to be on a spectrum of increasing refinement. Their character is related to different kinds of involvement with physiology and cognition. Yet they all exhibit different forms of sufficiency. Examples of independence or sufficiency of value are states calling for little external or cognitive support. For example, resilience, self-esteem, love, maturity, moral fortitude, heroism, meaning and courage. Now, what I want to do is extrapolate from these judgments to produce a plausible trajectory and preference. On this trajectory, sufficiency and independence from physiology and cognition have increasing preference. The potentially most refined states are value states that also offer properties of meaning and purpose. This leaves us looking for principles of value and for independent or sufficient value. I've thereby advocated the principle of the wills of value, resulting in a sufficiency of value. And these principles are in competition with the utilitarian principle of utility. Yet my arguments for principles of value go much further than these given above. In conclusion, my arguments have been largely critical of both utilitarianism and happiness, but I've compared the property of sufficiency in happiness with that same property in value states. And that leads me back to my principles of the wills of value and the sufficiency of value. We nevertheless noted several considerations in favour of utilitarianism. Firstly, utilitarianism sweeps aside problems of metaphysics, religion, and Kantian ethics. Happiness is also an accepted human good enshrined in aspirational documents like the US Constitution. Thirdly, utilitarianism endorses the importance of consequences in ethical considerations. And lastly, happiness is featured in some way in practically all theories of ethics. But the attractions of utilitarianism also contain its weaknesses. That is, as practical social policy, it's difficult to dispute. Yet as a theory of ethics, it is woefully inadequate. We should firstly note several technical problems of utilitarianism that we could just dismiss. There's the difficulty of assessment and measurement of happiness that is problematic for a practical theory. Then there's a problem of motivation of why an individual should act for the common good. But there are other problems that go to the heart of utilitarianism as a system, which technical solutions won't resolve. Firstly, there are the limitations of happiness as an ultimate value and doubts about its adequacy. There's also the limited scope of utilitarianism in accounting for the depth and breadth of human experience. And thirdly, we have the problem of negative psychological consequences in utilitarian behaviour. These problems might be thought to be mitigated by moving from utilitarianism to consequentialism. But consequentialism still retains a rationalist omission of certain aspects of moral and human experience. These are, for example, intentions that distinguish moral human action from animal and amoral action. Yet, as indicated, my interests in utilitarianism and consequentialism are negative as well as positive. That is, they are examples of a rationalist neglect of human life, human experience, and particularly of value. The prominence given to utilitarian happiness, however, leads to some very significant implications. These are not only the neglect of value in the concept of happiness, but that pleasure and happiness illustrate the property of sufficiency that can also be attributed to value states like self-esteem and meaning. Yet serious criticisms can also be made of other theories of ethics as well as utilitarianism. In the following weeks, I will be examining Kantian virtue theory and value theory ethics. But even these theories aren't able to offer an adequate account of human life and purpose. In response to that challenge, I will be examining other principles of value. So let me have your criticisms and comments at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.